It was funny. Someone said, "Wow," when we finished "We Three Kings." I was just thinking, even if I play the same song with the organ through my little Bluetooth speaker at home, it has nothing to sound in comparison to the organ, especially this close to it. That's one of those who probably could sing every Sunday. Susan would be okay with that. That's one of her favorites. It is today, as our celebration of Epiphany. Officially, it'll take place tomorrow, January the 6th, 12 days after Christmas. So we celebrate that, and the real light of the Epiphany is that Jesus is the light to the world. If you have to remember anything, that's what partly the wise men represent. These wise guys from afar realizes that Jesus is born, and that the heavens have aligned to the point of, and they decide to go after it. They decide to take their gifts and begin a journey to where that is. Scholars tell us that maybe perhaps we think that Jesus was about 2 years old whenever they arrived, and so it took them a little while to get there. But I'm always amazed that they began that journey. I was thinking about that. When we think about getting ready to go on a trip, to drive to Florida to the beach or something, that's a big process. I remember as a little kid, we would go to Florida for our summer vacation, and we would go with Grandma and Grandpa, and the back window of the Cadillac that Grandpa had would be full of Grandma's extra shoes and clothes that wouldn't fit in the rest of her bags. You couldn't see anything behind you. We had to go forward. But it was a process even for us to get ready to go for a week trip. But I can imagine me willing to get on a camel and travel for 2 years to get to a place, especially carrying around gold. I'm bad enough if I have to take, $200 between one bank or another. I'm a little nervous. I'm going to feel like a George Bailey's uncle and lose it, put it in the mail slot or something. I worry about that. But they did it. They got ready and they were willing to. The Magi, maybe perhaps that's why they call them wise men. Of course, the Greek would translate there both wise, it defaults to the masculine. So it could have been possibly some wise women included in that. We don't know. The Greek does not contain it. We don't have any photographs of the event. In fact, we don't even know that there were 3 wise men. Well, every nativity set that you ever see in a store usually has 3 wise men, though. But that's because of the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We assumed that one could only carry one thing. So they didn't want to lose it and forget it. They had one thing to keep up with. They all showed up. We don't know. There could have been a whole lot more. There could have been 12 or 15 of them. But anyway, so they were wise enough to slow down and to look at the stars, to look up into the heavens, and to follow the guidance that they saw around them. In our business of our world, sometimes it's really hard for us to slow down just a little bit, to take a quiet moment and just to listen to what God is saying to us. We often want to tell God what we want or what we need or what God needs to do for us or how helpful a parking spot close to the restaurant would be today. But sometimes God has stuff to say to us too, and we don't listen. It's a fact, sometimes when we look up in the skies and see something we're not familiar with and not ready for, we're already ready to call the FBI on the drone that we see. Now I see it's following around on the next door post here in Greensboro. There's 3 drones have been spotted 3 days in one place. And I'm like, did you think somebody might have gotten a drone for Christmas? It'll be okay. Somebody even reported to put a picture and they said, oh my gosh, I think I have flying objects over my house, and it was the Little Dipper. I'm like, calm down. Let's be a little bit use our brains on this, people. But, there is stuff around that might be different. Sometimes we do have to stop and pause and to listen to the leaves and the grass grow. We don't ever get that still. Maybe somewhere in the middle would be a place for us to ponder where God, especially at the beginning of a new year, where God is calling me to be this next year. How is God calling me to be different this next year? The world's certainly different now than it was then, but in some ways it's still kind of the same if you think about it. But this birth of Jesus was more than spectacular. I mean, we do know from just a few days ago that the shepherds were greeted by the angels. Peace I bring to all. A multitude of hosts gathered with them, and enough for them to journey in the middle of the night toward Bethlehem, toward the stable, to both meet the king and to guard him, some scholars suggest. But then now there's these stars that have arisen into the sky. Scholars and people who think about these things far more than I do thinks maybe it could be this aligning of multiple planets together at a certain time that took place. Maybe it could be possible they've done the calculations and now we have computers to help us. I don't know, but something guided the wise men there, either aligning of the planets or God's miraculous capabilities. But the star was noticed by Gentiles, non-Jewish people, in a very Jewish book of the Bible. I mean, this is kind of the birth, this is the important part. This is the introduction of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, which is the first gospel that links the New Testament and the Old Testament. It starts partly because they say that Matthew reached back into the history in the pages of the Old Testament to form that bridge between the Old Testament and the story that had come before to Jesus the Christ, to show that this is the Messiah. That's partly what they're doing here, linking back to Isaiah and other passages throughout the Testament to be able to make sure that people understood what was happening in front of them, just as the wise men had long ago. They didn't have any GPS. I mean, it wasn't like they could put in, Bethlehem or Jerusalem in their GPS and get there without missing a turn. Or if they did, it would recalculate. They didn't have the maps as we know them. I mean, even those of us who still know what a map is, that, a paper map that you could fold out and put together. They didn't have that. I'm sure they would kind of go from place to place and maybe pick up a guide or ask for directions, and to begin this long and tedious journey on the back of a camel. I didn't want to come to church this morning. I live 5 minutes away. It's too cold. The car doesn't get warm in this length of time. It's just going to be miserable. I'll just stay at home in my bed, which might not have been a bad idea if you're watching online. I want to be there with you, but I didn't want you to have to get filmed without me doing my hair. It'd be bad. But they were willing to do it. They were willing to get on the back of a camel and go across mountains and hills and valleys and dry land, all because they had seen this star in their world. This is not like a road trip. This is more like an Indiana Jones story, mixed with a good story from some southern author of fear and power and conniving. I mean, lots of fear. If one wanted to celebrate the birth of a new child in the kingdom, where would one go? The palace, the castle, the governor's mansion. And they do. They go to Jerusalem, the important city, and they go to the Herod, and they say, oh, we're here to congratulate the new king. Well, think how Herod's going to like that. Oh, wait a minute. I'm the only king that's in this spot. I'm the only one in control. I'm the only one in power. But they're here to celebrate this newborn king that a star rose in the palace has not had any grandchildren. So, but imagine if you were that ruler and suddenly greeted these strangers from afar at your house, and they said, oh, we're here to greet the real king. And you'd say, this is not real good. He does consult with the wisest people in his workings. And he says that he wants to greet the king too. Oh, come and let me know where he is, and I'm going to go too. But there's more to the plot to maintain his power. And of course, if you read on in the tragedy of Matthew, you'll read about the slaughtering of the innocents that take place, where he kill all the children under 2 years old out of fear. No, that's not the way peace comes into the world. That's not the way love's supposed to come into the world. But it looks a lot more like the world than it does a place of peace and the kingdom of God. But the wise men found Jesus in Bethlehem, and brought in the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh. The gold, of course, to recognize his kingship, and the frankincense and the myrrh. I like the line, the gathering doom. They represent the reminding of Jesus' sacrifice. We talked about that in Sunday school last week, I think it was, about the very idea that, the early church really celebrated Easter first. Christmas is almost an afterthought. Sorry for those of you who've worked so hard to make it perfect this year. But in the early church, it was really the afterthought. It was about 400 before really Christmas became to be a huge holiday in the church. And we recognize that, the early church, part of what Jesus was there for is the life and celebrate the resurrection. You can't celebrate the resurrection without honoring and respecting the death and the crucifixion. And if you couldn't have a crucifixion if you didn't have Jesus born. That's kind of the thought process, we think. But his death is always mindful in and around this time of the year, just as the wise men show. I always remembered my little home church. There were about 45 there on a Sunday. We thought we had a crowd. And yet we had enough kids that we would do a Christmas pageant play every year, Sometimes they had lines and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes I remembered mine and sometimes I didn't. But somehow I always got to be a shepherd. You got to wear a bathrobe in church. Everybody, who wants to bring that back? But we always, we had a corner over here. Mary and Joseph would always be you've seen these. It's on every third Hallmark movie that shows up in the season. There's the baby Jesus sitting here in the midst. Somebody got to be Mary and Joseph, and it wasn't me. I was a shepherd, and we were always over here by the side of the tree over here where there was a little plug-in, because we had an electric fire. It was so cool. It's like one like we have in the John Wesley room. I remember it's fake logs and a little piece of plastic, and there's a silver brush that rotates on the inside with a 60-watt light bulb or a 20-watt light bulb or whatever you're supposed to put in it. We'd sit over there and warm our hands and hold our staffs, the whole time. I always got to be a shepherd. I never got to be a wise man. Maybe that is saying something about me. I guess I probably should process that a little bit more. But I always remember that the wise men would always come in and they would be out in the vestibule, way out at the front, hiding, and they would come and that song would play, "We Three Kings," except it was always slower. "We three kings of Orient are." They would finally get down the aisle of our tiny little church, and they would be there, and it would be this scenic, and they would offer these gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. But I think while I was over there at the fire with the shepherds, whenever I finally got to be that, or I was waiting on the wise men to get there because we had to go home and get snacks. We had treats in the back, I was excited. I always wondered, I was like, if I got to be a wise man, would I be willing to make that journey? Sometimes we don't notice what we need to notice. And we fail to even look for it sometimes. But if I got to be a wise man, would I be willing to make that journey? Would I see enough signs in the world around me to recognize Christ's presence and the call of Christ on my life and the call of Christ to me to make the journey that I needed to make, whatever that was, however I needed to get there, and whatever weather it was, to be there? I hope so. I always think I would. So far, I've been making a journey for a few years now toward what I think God's calling me and has called me. But the real important question is, what would I do now that I've seen Jesus close up? How does it change my life, and how does it change my world? This is the beginning of a new year, a new day, a new dawn. Maybe a time for us just to ask ourselves again, how does my interaction and meeting Jesus again change my life and my world and my worldview, my value of other people, what I consider important in my life? Where's God calling me in that? The wise men, we learn from Scripture, return home from a different road, a different way. Maybe it changed their view of the world. They didn't need to go back by Herod's place and just let them know what's going on. They were willing to go and do something different because they'd met Jesus and seen him. A change is made by Jesus and who meets him. And how does it change us as individuals? Catherine of Siena, the 14th century writer, in her dialogue writes about the idea of that when we come together, one of the ways that Christ is revealed in us and the light is revealed in us is through the sacraments. And she gives this illustration in one of her writings, and she says that each of us are a candle. Some of us are a 1 ounce candle, and some of us are a half-pound candle. That's good. You don't have to change anything for New Year's on that end. But that we all come as a different candle, but when we come around the table, when we gather around the table, when we receive the sacrament, that the sacrament begins to light the candle in us, to light our candle and that we can glow, and that the fire is all the same for all of us. That fire of Christ within our life, regardless of how it might be a little bit different, but it transpires us and it encourages us to receive the light and to be nourished from within by the very Christ that we worship. That we are nurtured and cared for by the very light of the world, Christ himself. And in his light, our lives and our world continue to be changed and transformed and made perfect in his light and his love. All glory and power and honor be to the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.